Our scripture today comes from 1 Samuel. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At the time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, "Samuel, Samuel." And he said, "Here I am," and ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call. Lie down again." So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, "Samuel." Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that it was the Lord calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Then the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingle."
Tingle indeed. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Drew, you're all grown up. It's amazing. Oh my gosh. I was the first year I was here, I went out on the Faith Singers tour, and Drew was just amazing us with his piano playing then. And, I think it's what I love about this. One of the many things I love about this church is so many amazing youth here. And then, I don't know what's more amazing, just to see and be inspired by them while they're here or when they go out into the world then and come back and report all the things that are happening. It's really very, very inspiring. Well, I love this passage from 1 Samuel that you just heard, partly because it stands for a whole slew of passages in the Bible and brings a lot of insights together that have to do with calling, or vocatio, or vocation as the common term. But vocation is not just about a job you do, as Rebecca aptly noted. It's really about calling. It comes from the Latin vocare, which means to call. It's your calling in life. And one of the things I like about the passage is it shows a couple of interesting things. One is that by the time you become aware of your calling, you normally can look back and see that actually this sense of call has been coming to you repeatedly for a while, and you just haven't recognized it. Or you haven't recognized its source, or more likely even you haven't trusted it. So it keeps coming, and the beautiful thing is it will keep coming to you. It's not just kind of like, hear it, and if you miss it, it's gone. It just keeps coming and coming, gently offering a word to you. The other thing I love about this is that the passage says that Samuel really didn't know God. He was working as an assistant in the temple, but he really didn't know of God as a personal, in the personal sense, of God who actually has awareness of us and does communicate with us. And this night, he comes into that awareness. It's really his conversion as well as his calling. Then a story of that. And that is a very important principle. In the Bible, if you look at it, there is never a true conversion that happens without a call coming with it. And that's not just in the Bible. That's in our lives. You never come into a deep and personal sense that you are loved beyond your wildest imagination without then wanting to do something about it, wanting to orient your life around that very non-evident reality that is, though, spoken to your heart of hearts. And you want to share it with others as well. And so the Spirit is always more than happy to give us some suggestions about how to follow a call in life. But in the passage about Samuel, if you would read just a couple verses early, it ends. He's going to give a message. His call is he's going to become actually one of the greatest prophets that had lived. And King David and King Saul were both crowned as a result of Samuel's efforts. This little boy back in the temple days, grew up, did great things. But the first message that he has to deliver actually would be one of the hardest messages that any of us could possibly deliver. He actually has to tell Eli, the one who's just encouraged him to listen to God, that his ministry is over. Yeah. You can imagine, tingling ears, all right. Yeah, a pretty hard message. And that's an important part of call as well, that when we sense the call of the Spirit, it normally, we feel a bit of resistance to it because it feels like a challenge that's too great for us to do by ourselves. Like it's either too hard or it's too wonderful. That's the other thing. We don't feel like we deserve to go in that route. Oh, I'm not possibly good enough, or I'm not possibly practiced enough, or whatever it is. No, that's too much. It feels like an undeserved compliment oftentimes. And so we resist. But that's really our concern, not God's, because we kind of think in our just normal minds that we're going to have to do this all by ourselves. God's thinking we're going to be doing this with God's help. So God's not nearly as concerned as we are. And so calling always challenges us to pay attention to certain voices within ourselves over others. There's the voice of the courageous self and the voice of the uncourageous self, the voice of the true self, and the voice of the self that's really operating on not its central energy. The following poem is written by one of my favorite poets, David White, from a book that actually just is, I would say it's hot off the press, except on an iPad, you can't really feel the temperature of the pages. It deals with those voices within us when we sense our call. The poem is called Second Life. He writes, my uncourageous life doesn't want to go, doesn't want to speak, doesn't want to carry on, wants to make its way through stealth, wants to assume the strange and dubious honor of not being heard. My uncourageous life doesn't want to move, doesn't want to stir, wants to inhabit a difficult form of stillness, to pull everything into the silence where the throat strains but gives no voice. My uncourageous life wants to stop the whole world and keep it stopped, not only for itself, but for everyone and everything it knows, refusing to stir a single inch until given an exact and final destination. This uncourageous second life wants to win some undeserved lottery so it can finally bestow a just and final reward upon itself. No. This second life never wants to write or speak or cook or set the table or welcome guests or sit up talking with a stranger who might accidentally set us traveling again. This second life doesn't want to leave the door, doesn't want to take any path that works its own sweet way through mountains, doesn't want to follow the beckoning flow of a distant river, or meet the chance weather where a pass takes us from one discovered world to another. This second life just wants to lie down and tell God it has a headache. But my other life, my first life, the life I admire and want to follow, looks on and listens with some wonder and even extends a reassuring hand for the one holding back, knowing there can be no real confrontation without the need to turn away and go back away from it all, to have things be different, and to close your eyes until they are different. No, this hidden life, this first courageous life, seems to speak from silence and in the language of a knowing, beautiful heartbreak. Above all, it seems to know well enough, it will have to give back everything received in any form, and even sometimes, as it tells the story of the way ahead, laughs out loud in the knowledge. This first life seems sure and steadfast in knowing it will come across the help it needs at every critical place. This first life seems sure and steadfast in knowing it will come across the help it needs in every crucial place, and thus continually sharpens my sense of impending revelation. The first courageous life, in fact, has already gone ahead and has nowhere to go except out the door into the clean air of morning, taking me with it. Nothing to do except breathe while it can. No way to travel but with that familiar pilgrim movement of the body. Nothing to teach except to show me on the long road how we sometimes like to walk alone, open to the silent revelation, and then stop and gather and share everything as dark comes in, telling the story of the day's accidental beauty. And perhaps most intriguingly, most poignantly, and most fearfully of all, and at the very end of the long road it has traveled, it wants to take me to a high place from which to see, with a view looking back on the way we took to get there, so it can have me understand myself as witness, and thus beneath me the way ahead, so that it can teach me how to invent my own disappearance, so that it can lie down at the end and show me, even against my will, how to undo myself, how to surpass myself, how to find a way to die of generosity. If you've been reading Bruce Van Blair's Commitments of the Christian Life as a companion to this series, I'm sure you'll be delighted by the reflection that he offers about vocatio, or calling, vocation, in his own reflection. One of the things I loved best about Bruce's reflection that made me laugh out loud was where he lists some typical expectations that most churches have about what it means to be a member of a church. He lists 6 of them. See if you don't recognize these. First of all, attend worship faithfully. Second, give more money to the church, always. Third, be willing to serve on a board or committee, or maybe teach Sunday school. Fourth, when possible, respond to the needs we bring before you. 5, live an exemplary life in the community. And finally, be nice to each other. At least be friendly to newcomers, welcoming new newcomers. You see glaring omissions on that list? It's a pretty standard list, but anything that just really sticks out like a sore thumb? I mean, there's a few things missing, but the biggest one I see absent on that list is like the most important commitment of all that we do as if we're going to be part of a church. That is, we turn our lives over to God. Not turning our lives over, all that other stuff is just kind of fluff. It's meaningless. What does it mean to turn our lives over to God? It means to find your calling. Many people think of calling as doing that which you feel guilty like you should do, because it's something you absolutely don't want to do, so you can prove your faithfulness to God by doing it anyway, right? Out of a sense of duty or obligation. Many of us feel calling is to follow the route of Mother Teresa to the streets of Calcutta, ministering amongst the poorest of the poor in the world. Well, I have little doubt that that was Mother Teresa's calling and the calling for many, but it's also not the calling for many. Calling in the tradition has nothing to do with guilt or doing that which you are not oriented to do as you are created to do it. Calling has to do, as we've talked about repeatedly here, sweet spot. Sweet spot. Baseball bats, golf clubs, tennis rackets, they all have sweet spots. And that sweet spot on a tennis racket is that place just off center where the vibrations from the ball hitting the racket, the vibrations on either end of the racket, then exactly cancel each other out. So that all the power you've put into the swing goes right into sending the ball over the net rather than into absorbing the impact of those vibrations. You have a sweet spot yourself. Yeah. A sense within you that when you are flowing with your calling, it feels most natural. You feel like your power is most fully able to put into it. You are most wholehearted in that effort. And then what I love about the image of the sweet spot and a tennis racket, for instance, is that it also acknowledges that when you are responding to a sense of call, it doesn't mean that you're going to be absent of conflict or struggle in life. In fact, the impact of that ball sets a lot of vibrations that are going contrary to one another going. And that is what happens when we follow our call. It does not rid us of our shortcomings or our failings or our struggles in life. It actually sets them resonating in such a way that they begin to work for us, not against us. I know of no other aspect of life that does this, that actually takes the things that you and I struggle with, the things that we beat ourselves up about, that our failings and those times where we just are questioning or lost or feeling empty or feeling like a failure, all those things that resonate within us. And actually, when oriented around where we're called to go, what we're called to be doing, actually sets them moving in a positive direction for us, starts feeding us rather than taking energy away. Now, Melanie and I, many of you know, came back from Ireland just recently on a study leave, and there we looked at a number of sites that are associated with the ancient Celtic folks and the saints, and some of those places David White actually has written about. There's this one place we visited on a little island of Inishbofin that was said to be where St. Colman came and stayed in a cave and stayed there until he had his sense of calling, until, in the words of David White's poem, the sound, he stayed in that place until the current of the story was strong enough to float him out. And at the end of the poem, he reminds us about what it means to find our calling in life, which is that we become the ancestor of it all in our own world, the quiet and robust and blessed saint that your future happiness will always remember. By following a sense of call now, essentially what you're doing by finding that sweet spot and acting from that center of your being, you set yourself up so that years later you can look back and you are your own saint. You're the one that you will say, thank God for that person who followed back then, because it has blessed me so much. Now, when Melanie and I toured around Ireland, one of the things, the people we heard about over and over again, which is still, he lived in the 5th century, but people still absolutely adore him, is this person, St. Patrick. Now, St. Patrick, we associate America with St. Patrick's Day and like drinking green beer and passing out, things like that. That's not at all what St. Patrick represents in Ireland. St. Patrick's Day in Ireland is actually a high sacred holiday. It's not this crazy kind of version of Mardi Gras or something. It is a serious holiday because Patrick did the country a serious amount of good, which is surprising given his background. You see, Patrick was born in Great Britain in the 5th century, and at an early age he was captured by Irish pirates. And there he was taken to Ireland, sold into slavery, and was then for years a shepherd boy out in the cold and damp of Ireland with very few clothes and very little food, half the time starving to death. For years he was a shepherd boy, and then at one point he had an experience kind of like Samuel with those repeated dreams. Repeatedly in his dreams, he kept a message coming, your home is upon you. You're about to go home. You're about to go home. And finally he had a dream that said, your ship has come in. Well, I don't know about you, but I have a lot of dreams that tell me a lot of things I don't necessarily act on. Patrick, though, had this series, started seeing some continuity between these dreams. When that voice hit him, your ship has come in, he took that seriously. He actually escaped and walked 200 miles to the coast and cajoled a ship captain to take him on board, which then took him home. Years later, then he became a priest and was doing just fine, doing very well as a priest. And as he became a priest, one of the insights that really sunk in deeply for Patrick was just how deeply we are connected with God, all of us, in a very real, palpable way, such that this God actually does have awareness of us and is able to communicate in that well of wells inside. And that this God actually knows then everything about us, everything we do and everything we don't do, and yet loves us anyway, fully. Well, there's a little problem in coming into a direct awareness that you are loved beyond your wildest imagination. Because usually that vision that you are loved is accompanied by the awareness that everybody else is loved just like you are. And when you really come into that awareness that you and all people are loved in this way, the Spirit has a way of calling us to love the very ones that we don't necessarily love beyond their wildest imagination. And sure enough, at one point, Patrick felt a clear call to go back to the very ones that would be his most likely people to hate beyond their wildest imagination, which were the very people who enslaved him. He went back to Ireland and became a witness to this wonderful faith amongst them. But he went back not out of a sense of guilt, but actually with a sense of excitement and joy, to actually bring to people who had been capable of treating people so badly this message that they and all are loved. Well, one thing about Patrick and his sense of spirituality, he was really probably the greatest Christian missionary since St. Paul. And yet, the way he spread the gospel was very different from the way we conceive it in our day, like where people come and say, do you know Jesus? If you don't know nothing. In fact, you're going to hell, right? You don't have any corner in the truth if you don't know Jesus. So listen to me, and then you'll have the truth, right? That had nothing to do with Patrick's message. Patrick had an awareness that we are all hardwired into God on a deep level. And because we're all hardwired, in that sense, that's a bit anachronistic, hardwired, but we're connected on that deep level, that we are truly loved, no matter what. And because we're truly loved, and because this God is aware of us, Patrick also took as a given that this God was able to communicate with people whether they recognize this God or not. Kind of like Samuel in the dream, calling over and over. All of us have that awareness of God. And so the people he met up with, he did not take the idea that they knew nothing until he came. Rather, he took the idea that they knew something, that they actually knew God, the very God that he was going to proclaim. He was just going to give that a bigger context than they were aware of. And he took as a given that even though they didn't trust the impulse, and certainly the native Celtic religions did not trust this impulse, they certainly would have had regular messages when they were still and at peace, and simply receptive to the world, that there is this ocean of love that surrounds them. His message was not, believe me and get saved. His message was, you are already saved. Now start living according to that reality. Start living to the love that you've already received. Orient your whole life around it. Flow with it. And in contrast to every single major missionary effort that's ever taken place, Patrick's mission and his predecessor was never encountered violence by the native people. Why? Because he respected them. He knew that he wasn't just bringing God's own truth to them, that he was connecting truth that already was to this wider context. Consequently, people started getting really excited. They started getting it. I've been getting that message all the time. I never trusted it. When they started trusting it, they started wanting to act on it. Consequently, Patrick and his successors, people kept coming up saying, what do I do about this? And so people were starting to find their own sweet spots. Some people said, I want to dedicate myself full time to spreading this message. How do I do that? And enough of them do that throughout all of Ireland, Patrick and others then set up these small communities of 12 people. So if you want to just completely throw yourself into this mission of God's on earth, gather with 12, and we've got a task for you. You live in harmony with each other, and we're going to give you some books. We want you to get literate as fast as possible. And then we want you to once you're literate, we want you to start copying this manuscripts, because the world needs more of this wisdom that's been collected through the ages. And so throughout Ireland, you find these monasteries that were set up, hundreds and thousands of them, set up these little groups of 12, but then the power of what was going on would attract more and more people. They grow into these larger communities all over the place, including this place that we went off 5 miles off the coast of Ireland, and on the top of this rock named Skellig Michael. Literally, there's a monastery on the top of that rock. I have a hard time even imagining how you'd climb up the rock to begin with, let alone build a solid stone monastery up there in hermitages and so forth. They were copying texts clear up on top of Skellig Michael. In fact, they found that a helpful place because it was hard to invade. And so those texts could stay safe. But you see, you can see a little stone path that's up in the grass field there. Going up, and at the very top, there's this great monastery. They're doing this all over the place. Well, what really speaks to me, they were really copying the great wisdom of Western civilization. Not just Christian literature, any literature they could get their hands on, copying text after text. And if you look at the manuscripts they copied, it's so evident that they were having fun. They weren't just simply saying, oh, now we got all this work to do. They were actually, this was their sweet spot. They were having, you look at the illustrations. The Book of Kells is a great example of that. But they would just put these wonderful images from the natural world and so forth all over the pages just because it was beautiful. And they loved to do it. So not only the wisdom, but all this great artwork got carried down. And the really significant thing about that is the time period. This happened between the 5th and the 10th century in Ireland. It's the exact period that in the Roman Empire was crumbling. You read in your college history book about Goths and Visigoths and Vandals and all this. The Roman Empire was completely crumbling. All these texts that they have were being burnt as libraries were being burnt in warfare and so forth. All that stuff was vanishing. At the same time, over in Ireland, in the equivalent of Timbuktu, where nobody was paying attention, there was this incredible golden age going on, and it was very much sparked by Patrick and all these people of groups of 12 who were gathering and doing all this stuff. It is because of all that copying that you and I actually have access to most of the literature, all that great ancient literature, especially that which was Latin literature. It literally would not exist if it weren't for these little groups of 12 people following their sense of call in the world. Thomas Cahill writes about that in a book called How the Irish Saved Civilization. This is how. And it's not that they had this concept they were saving Western civilization. They were just doing what they felt called to do, how to channel their love in the way they best knew how. Well, the other piece of being in Ireland was not simply to kind of bring together the threads of all this study of Celtic Christianity I've been doing. I was actually introduced to Celtic Christianity, at least the depths of it, through the poet David Whyte when I was with him in northern England in 2009, reading to me the texts of some of the great Irish poets, and he spent a lot of time there. So we spent a lot of time actually going to sites that he has written poems about. One of those sites is associated with Patrick. It's called, in Gaelic, Tobar Fadrek, which means Patrick's Well. Interesting about Ireland, there's hundreds of holy wells all around, about 300 that we know of. And we don't really have that tradition in our country. There are a lot of countries that do. I don't really know that the water coming out of those wells is necessarily holy. In fact, some of it seems pretty dingy. However, I think it's a wonderful tradition in the sense that there are the holy wells really They create a meeting place between ourselves and God. Not that God can't be met anywhere, but they really mark a place where you can go and say, you know what, I'm going to be intentional about meeting up with God. I'm going to be more open than usual because I'm not going to have the TV on. I'm not going to be trying to run my kids to soccer practice. I'm not going to be trying to make a living right there. I'm actually going to set everything down, and I'm going to go to this place to be able to communicate with this God who apparently has awareness of me. If God does have awareness of me and is able to communicate, I want to do that. So people may have, over centuries, have made their way to these holy wells, not because they're holy in themselves, but because what happens there is holy, meeting with God. And White, in this wonderful poem, really deals with what happens in these meetings and the struggle that we have to deal with between those voices in our head when we sense our call that says, "You idiot. You think you're so holy to just be called by God into doing what you're doing? Really? Seriously? You think that God's, not too busy for you? Or you think that, look at the way you live your life. Come on, really? A call? There's that voice. You ever hear that voice? So there's that voice. And then there's the voice that the first self listens to. So this poem is about going to a holy well, not because itself is so holy, it's because we need in our lives to disappear to some voices. Those voices say, you ain't nothing but a scumbag, far be it from you. And we need to reappear only in the world, only in those places that are capable of naming us with a name that is great enough to contain us. That will not put a name on us that is too small for us. I'm going to read the poem and go back for its meaning. He writes, "Turn sideways into the light, as they say the old ones did, and disappear into the originality of it all. Be impatient with easy explanations and teach that part of the mind that wants to know everything not to begin questions it cannot answer. Walk the green road above the bay and the low glinting fields beyond the evening sun. Let that Atlantic gleam be ahead of you and the gray light of the bay below you until you catch, down on your left, the break in the wall. For just above in the shadows you'll find it hidden, a curved arm of rock holding the water close to the mountain. A just lit surface smoothing a scattering of coins, and in the niche above notes to the dead and supplications for those who still live. But for now, you are alone with the transfiguration. And ask no healing for your own, but look down as if looking through time, as if through a rent veil from the other side of the question you've refused to ask. And you remember now that clear stream of generosity from which you drank, how as a child your arms could rise and your palms turn out to hold the blessing of the world." That's Patrick, by the way, on that stone. I don't know if that's a real-to-life carving or not, but it's an ancient one. The first part of that poem, "Turn sideways into the light, as they say the old ones did, and disappear." That's a reference to actually this ancient mythological people in Ireland called the Tuatha Dé Danann. Tuatha Dé Danann. Say that 3 times fast. They were a mythical people who were said to be higher than human beings, closer, more divine, and consequently quite generous and gentle. When humans came into the land, these Tuatha Dé Danann tried to interact with them, but the humans were just very warlike and coarse, and they finally, in exasperation one day, it said that they turned sideways into the light and disappeared. And they went off to inhabit then the netherworld, and probably they're the mythological predecessors of the leprechauns, actually. Another story that's been bastardized in our tradition. But in any case, what they really did was, that the power of these people was naming them with a name that was too small for them. So they knew better. They turned sideways, disappeared. You and I need to turn sideways and disappear sometimes. Yeah. There are kind of common times where we kind of want to do that. You're at a dinner party, somebody's been harping at your ear for 20 minutes, you kind of want to turn sideways in the light and disappear, right? There's also those times when you get up in the morning and you're having your morning coffee, your spouse comes down the stairs and you say good morning, and the way she looks at you suggests you better turn sideways into the light and disappear. There are those times too. I'm not making reference to my own relationship, I'm just kind of giving out hypotheticals. But there are also times when the world throws at us that stuff that likes to stick to us about, because we all struggle and we all feel yearnings that are unfulfilled. And a lot of times there are voices that take that struggle and those unfulfilled yearnings and say, you know why that's all it is? Why you struggle and why you yearn so much is because you are intrinsically flawed. And we have to turn sideways, learn to turn sideways into the light and disappear before those voices, because they try to name us with a name that is far too small for us as creations of God. And so White says then to walk the green road above the bay. This is actually the road to Tobar Patrick. Walk the green road above the bay. Let that Atlantic gleam, that's Galway Bay down below, let that Atlantic gleam be ahead of you and the gray light of the bay below you. Until you catch, just down on your left, that break in the wall. We actually walked right past the break. We missed it. And so we walked another hour looking for Tobar Patrick until we finally gave up and walked back. And then Melanie found it on the way back. Until you catch that break to your left in the wall. For just above, in the shadow, you'll find it hidden. Do you see it hidden there? A curved arm of rock holding the water close to the mountain. Close to the mountain. This is the upper pool of Tobar Patrick. And in the niche above, notes to the dead and supplications to those who still live. That water flows to then what is the official well of St. Patrick right here. And oh, the gift of being at a place such as this alone, just by yourself, a designated meeting spot. We all have those places we can find. They don't have to be a holy well. They might be the chair in your den in the early morning hours, or maybe a worship service, maybe a communion table as a holy well, or maybe a walk through the Fontenelle Forest. It's your meeting place. We all have these places where we can be alone before the holiness. And in that spot, then, move from our disappearance to reappear in the world, in a place that is holy enough and sacred enough to name us appropriately. He says, now you are alone with the transfiguration. Now you are alone with the transfiguration. And that's no healing for your own, because that only gets into that whole bit about you being sick and struggling and worthless and so forth. Don't ask for healing here at the point. Ask about who you are, not who you're not. Ask for no healing for your own, but look down as if looking through time. Catch your reflection in that pool, as if looking through time. As if through the rent veil from the other side of the question you refused to ask. In these places of holiness, when we're alone and can actually listen to the voices around us, and in a place where we've come to meet God, so we have come to meet the voices that are great enough to name us. It is in those places where it is safe then to imagine yourself. To ask, what is the face I want to inhabit in my later years? Abraham Lincoln said, above age 50, we're all responsible for our own face. So I got one more year left, and I'm responsible for this ugly thing. But really, to imagine, to be in a place where you can imagine, what is the face I want to stare into years from now? And how can I orient my life so that I could actually create that face? So that when I have that face, I can look back and recognize my own sainthood, the one who brought me, helped bring me to this place. Look into that sacred place. And then remember how as a child your arms could rise and your palms turn out and bless the world. Remember that you've always known who you are. When you were a child, before the world taught you that you were no good. When you were a child, before the world taught you you couldn't accomplish great things. Before the world taught you that God didn't have enough time for you, you could simply let yourself be a blessing. Certainly that's what happened with Patrick, remembering that day before he learned about people who would try to put a name on him that was far too small. And he could turn out his arms and bless. No, you find that place, that meeting place between yourself and God. Find it on a regular basis, because that's the place that can name you appropriately. That's the place who knows who you are and whose you are. And the beautiful thing about finding that place and that face that you want to live into is it has nothing to do with ridding yourself of conflict in your life or the way you struggle. It's not even about perfecting yourself so much as orienting yourself within your imperfections and your struggles and your shortcomings and your failings and your emptiness and all those things, orienting yourself in the direction that where even those begin to become source of life and strength and light. God is not concerned about perfection. God is concerned with relationship. It's through relationship that all that begins to flow and bless the world, such that you become the ancestor of it all, the quiet and robust saint that your future happiness and many of ours will remember.